The sun dipped low over the small, bustling neighborhood of Eastgate, casting long golden shadows across rows of aging brick buildings. On the corner of Clover Avenue, Brooks Market stood resilient, its vibrant blue sign a familiar beacon for residents who'd grown up buying milk, bread, and small comforts from its shelves. Behind the counter, Calvin Brooks wiped down the glass display with practiced movements. At 45, Calvin was lean and composed, his sharp gray eyes betraying a past he rarely spoke of. His military days were long behind him, but the discipline, the instincts, they never left. It had been 2 years since Calvin settled into this life. He liked the rhythm of it, stocking shelves, greeting customers by name, and feeling the neighborhood's pulse hum through the walls of his store. In a rapidly changing world, Brooks Market was a sanctuary. Today was no different, at least, it shouldn't have been. The small bell above the door jingled, and Ella Parker, a regular with 2 kids in tow, walked in. "Morning, Mr. Brooks," she said cheerfully, corralling her youngest who made a beeline for the candy aisle. "Morning, Ella. How's school treating them?" Calvin asked, offering a rare smile. Ella chuckled. "Oh, they're learning all right. Me? Not so much patience." Calvin laughed softly, stepping behind the counter to ring up her essentials. It was the kind of moment he'd grown to treasure. Small, simple, human. He was halfway through handing Ella her change when something outside caught his eye. Across the street, a beat-up black SUV idled just a little too long, its tinted windows obscuring the interior. Calvin's expression hardened ever so slightly, but he didn't let it show. "Everything okay?" Ella asked, noticing his sudden pause. "Yeah," Calvin replied quickly, forcing the calm back into his voice. "You take care now." Ella nodded, gathering her bags and ushering the kids out. The bell chimed again, leaving Calvin alone. The street outside had quieted. He cast a sharp glance at the SUV before it finally pulled away, the sound of its engine fading into the distance. That evening, as Calvin locked up, he couldn't shake the nagging feeling in his gut. Old instincts stirred, instincts honed on distant battlefields, where trouble was a shadow you learned to recognize long before it struck. Just as he turned to leave, he noticed something out of place. The lock on the back door sat slightly crooked. Someone had tried to tamper with it. Calvin knelt down, his trained eyes catching the telltale scrape marks near the latch. Whoever it was hadn't gotten in. He'd reinforced the locks himself, but the attempt was enough to make his muscles coil with tension. He stood, scanning the narrow alley behind the store. It was empty. "Not tonight," he muttered to himself, stepping back inside. He flicked through the security camera feed in his small office, rewinding until he saw it, 2 figures in hoodies loitering by the back door just after sunset. The footage didn't show their faces, but it didn't matter. Calvin could read their body language. They weren't here to shop. He sat back in his chair, rubbing his jaw thoughtfully. Trouble was coming. He could feel it. The next day began like any other, the attempted break-in little more than a weight in the back of Calvin's mind. He was prepared for petty crime. Every store owner was. But what he wasn't prepared for walked through his front door just after noon. The bell chimed, and 3 men entered. Their presence disrupted the natural hum of the store, sending a ripple of unease through the customers browsing nearby. The leader was a tall, wiry man with slicked-back hair and a smile that didn't reach his eyes. He stepped up to the counter with a swagger that screamed trouble. "Nice place you got here," the man said, his voice a smooth drawl. "Real nice." Calvin met his gaze without blinking. "Something I can help you with?" The man chuckled, glancing at the shelves. "Yeah, you can help yourself. Sell this place, while you still can." Calvin's fingers tapped the countertop, but his expression remained stone cold. "I'm not interested." The man's smile widened, but there was no humor in it. "Oh, I think you will be. You see, this neighborhood? It's changing. People like you. You're holding it back. My friends and I? We're here to help." At this, one of the men, a stocky brute, stepped toward a display, knocking a row of cans to the floor with deliberate slowness. The clattering sound echoed through the small space. A teenage customer near the drinks fridge froze, his eyes darting toward Calvin nervously. Calvin's voice came out low, even. "Pick that up." The stocky man grinned, his hands stuffed into his pockets as he ignored the command. The leader leaned closer to Calvin, dropping his voice to a near whisper. "We're giving you a chance, old man. Sell the store. Or next time, we won't be so polite." Calvin didn't move, didn't blink. "You've said your piece. Now leave." For a moment, the man just stared, his smile twisting into something darker. Finally, he turned on his heel and motioned to his crew. "Let's go." The men sauntered out, the stocky one giving the display one last shove as he passed. Cans rolled across the tile floor as the bell jingled ominously behind them. Silence filled the store. Calvin stood motionless, his jaw tight, the muscles in his arms flexed beneath his shirt. He knew exactly what they were. Enforcers sent to strong-arm him into giving up. But giving up wasn't in his vocabulary. He slowly walked around the counter, crouching to pick up the cans. Behind him, the teenage customer finally spoke. "Mr. Brooks? You okay?" Calvin stood, holding the dented cans in one hand. His expression was calm, but his voice was steel. "Don't worry about me, kid. Go on home." As the boy slipped out, Calvin turned toward the back office. He locked the door behind him and pulled out his phone, scrolling through his contacts until he reached a name he hadn't dialed in years. Marcus Evans. The line rang twice before a gravelly voice answered. "Calvin? Didn't expect to hear from you." Calvin stared at the security monitor, replaying the footage of the men knocking over his shelves. "I might need your help," he said quietly. "Someone's trying to start something they can't finish." This opening establishes the central conflict. Calvin Brooks, a former Marine, is being targeted by violent enforcers pushing him to sell his store. It introduces his quiet strength, the looming threat, and his determination to fight back. The morning air hung heavy with humidity as Calvin Brooks stood in front of his store, his arms folded across his chest. The events of the previous day played on a loop in his mind. The slicked-back thug, the shattered cans on the floor, and the veiled threats that still echoed like a warning bell. He'd cleaned up the mess, but something in his gut told him the real trouble was just getting started. Across the street, the neighborhood looked as it always did. Kids riding bikes down cracked sidewalks, cars sputtering past with busted mufflers, and shopkeepers sweeping the pavement in front of their businesses. But Calvin saw things differently now. He noticed the way people glanced over their shoulders. The shift in the rhythm of the streets was subtle but real, like a storm looming just over the horizon. The faint crunch of footsteps behind him snapped him from his thoughts. Calvin turned to see Marcus Evans striding toward him. Marcus hadn't changed much in the decade since they'd served together in Afghanistan. Broad-shouldered, with a shaved head and the same watchful eyes that had seen too much, Marcus moved with purpose. He wore a denim jacket over a plain black t-shirt, blending in perfectly with Eastgate's working-class vibe. "Still looking like you're ready for war," Marcus said, his deep voice rumbling like distant thunder. He stopped in front of the store, his gaze sweeping the area. "What's going on, Calvin?" Calvin unlocked the door to the market and stepped inside, the faint jingle of the bell following them. "Someone's trying to push me out." Marcus frowned, looking around the neat aisles. "Who?" "3 men came in yesterday. Threatened me. Told me to sell. They're working for someone bigger. Didn't say who, but I'm not stupid. This is organized." Marcus nodded slowly, running his hand over the back of his head. "And they targeted you why? Because you're an easy mark?" Calvin's lips twitched in a humorless smile. "That's what they think." Marcus let out a low whistle. "You don't need me to remind you. Guys like that don't back down easy." "I know," Calvin replied, heading to the back of the store. "But I'm not rolling over for them." Calvin flipped on the monitor in his small office, pulling up the security footage. He paused on the image of the 3 men. Marcus leaned over his shoulder, studying the screen. "This guy," Calvin said, pointing to the man with the slicked-back hair. "He's the leader. The other 2? Muscle." The big one knocked over a shelf just to prove a point. Marcus squinted at the footage. "They look sloppy. Guys like that only get sent when someone higher up doesn't want to get their hands dirty." "You're right. This is organized." Calvin's gaze stayed fixed on the screen. "You think you can look into them?" Marcus grinned faintly. "You know I can." Calvin straightened, crossing his arms again. Good. Start with the car. Black SUV, tinted windows. Shouldn't be hard to track. Marcus nodded. I'll run the plates through a few systems, see what turns up. He paused, his eyes narrowing slightly. But Calvin, what's your plan when these guys come back? Calvin turned to look at him, his face hard as granite. I'll be ready. Marcus shook his head. You always were a stubborn son of a gun. By mid-afternoon, Calvin had returned to his routine. Customers filtered in and out, unaware of the weight pressing on his mind. He exchanged small talk, restocked shelves, and kept his sharp eyes on the street through the window. It was an ordinary day, but Calvin knew it wouldn't last. Just before sundown, as Calvin wiped down the counter, the bell chimed again. This time, it wasn't a customer. The slicked-back man, flanked by his two goons, strolled inside as if he owned the place. Calvin's muscles tensed, but he didn't let it show. He straightened, setting the rag aside as he faced them. You're back sooner than I thought, Calvin said evenly. The leader grinned, his teeth flashing like a shark's. We missed you, Mr. Brooks. Thought we'd stop by and see if you've had time to reconsider. Not interested, Calvin replied coolly. The leader's smile faded. He stepped closer to the counter, his tone dropping into something darker. You're making this harder than it needs to be. You sell this place now, and you walk away clean. Otherwise, the stocky man smirked as he grabbed a jar of sauce off the shelf, turning it over lazily in his hands. Calvin's patience wore thin as the jar hovered just above the floor. Put it back, Calvin said quietly. The man grinned, his arm twitching like he was about to drop it. Calvin's voice cut through the tension like steel. I said, put it back. The leader raised a hand, signaling his thug to stop. The jar went back on the shelf with a clink, but the air was thick with unspoken violence. You got a mouth on you, old man, the leader said, his voice edged with irritation. But that's fine. We'll be back real soon. And next time, you won't like how we handle things. Calvin didn't blink. Get out. For a long moment, the men didn't move. Calvin held their gaze, his silence more threatening than any words he could have said. Finally, the leader motioned to his crew, and they turned to leave. The bell jingled as they stepped out, but Calvin knew this wasn't over. That night, Calvin sat in the back office, his mind racing. Marcus had texted him earlier with a lead on the SUV, registered to a rental company, paid for in cash. It was a dead end, but Marcus wasn't giving up. The silence in the store felt different now, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. Calvin leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. Memories of his time overseas crept in, patrolling narrow alleys, sensing danger before it struck, and knowing exactly when to move. The rules were different here, but the feeling was the same. Trouble was circling him, and it was only a matter of time before it struck again. A faint noise jolted him upright. He froze, listening intently. Footsteps. Outside. Calvin grabbed the small baton he kept under the counter, its solid weight familiar in his grip. Moving silently, he slipped through the darkened store and peered through the back window. The alley was shrouded in shadows, but movement caught his eye. Two figures stood by the back door, their silhouettes barely visible in the dim light. One of them knelt down, working at the lock. Not tonight, Calvin muttered under his breath. He moved quickly but silently, stepping outside and flanking the men before they realized he was there. The lockpick turned just as Calvin's voice rang out, sharp as a gunshot. Step away. The two men froze. One of them, the stocky thug from earlier, turned slowly, recognition flashing in his eyes. You. Before he could finish, Calvin moved. He struck the first man's wrist with the baton, sending the lockpick clattering to the ground. The thug cursed, stumbling back, but Calvin was already on him. A sharp jab to the gut dropped him to his knees. The second man rushed forward, but Calvin pivoted smoothly, sidestepping his charge and swinging the baton across his thigh. The man yelped, collapsing to the pavement. Both men groaned, their attempts to rise futile. Calvin loomed over them, his voice low and dangerous. You tell your boss I'm not for sale, and next time you come back, I won't go easy. The men didn't argue. They scrambled to their feet, limping away into the darkness. Calvin watched until they disappeared down the alley, the sound of their footsteps fading. He turned back toward the store, his expression hard as stone. This was his ground, his community, and no one, not these thugs, not whoever sent them, was going to take it from him. As he stepped back inside, Calvin locked the door, reinforced the bolt, and settled behind the counter. The shadows outside might be closing in, but Calvin Brooks was ready. And this time, they learned just how wrong they were to target him. The next morning, the sun rose over Eastgate, but the light did little to chase away the shadows lurking in Calvin Brooks' mind. Last night's encounter played over in his head. The thugs scrambling away after he'd made his point with the baton, their curses and promises lingering like smoke. Calvin knew it wouldn't stop them. Men like that didn't give up. They regrouped, they planned, and they came back harder. He stood in the back alley now, staring at the faint scuff marks near his back door where the lock had been tampered with. The marks were small, but they told him everything he needed to know. The crew was testing him, probing for weakness. They wouldn't let up until either he was gone or they were. Calvin tightened the strap of his work gloves and unlocked the door, stepping inside the store. He flicked on the lights, but something felt different, off, like the quiet before a gunfight. Calvin's instincts, honed through years of military training, bristled. He checked the aisles methodically, taking his time as he made his rounds. Everything looked normal. Shelves were neatly stocked. The counter sat untouched. But Calvin noticed it immediately, the faint outline of muddy boot prints near the side door. Someone had been inside. Recently. His jaw tightened as he crouched to examine the prints. They led toward the storage room in the back. Calvin stood and approached cautiously, his hand brushing the handle of the baton tucked under his apron. When he reached the door, he pressed his ear against it, listening. Silence. He pushed the door open and froze. The words, "Get out," were spray-painted in bright red across the back wall. Below, boxes of canned goods had been ripped open, the contents dumped across the floor. The vandals had been deliberate. This wasn't petty theft, it was a warning. Calvin's grip on the baton tightened, his knuckles going white. He exhaled slowly through his nose, forcing the anger bubbling up inside him to stay under control. That was the trick. Never let them see you sweat. Still, this was more than a message. It was escalation, and Calvin knew it wouldn't end here. He walked back to the counter, his movements slow and deliberate as he reached for his phone. Scrolling through his contacts, he dialed Marcus. Yeah. Marcus' voice was gruff, but awake. They broke in, Calvin said flatly. Spray-painted my storage room. Left the place a mess. There was a pause on the other end. They're pushing you. I figured that out already. Marcus sighed. You call the cops? Calvin hesitated. Not yet. You need to, Marcus said firmly. This isn't just scare tactics anymore. If you don't file a report, it's gonna look like you're not taking it seriously. And trust me, if this keeps going south, you want that paper trail. Calvin ran a hand over his face, frustration simmering just below the surface. He'd dealt with worse in his life, but this was different. This wasn't a battlefield in the middle of nowhere. This was his home, his community. People he cared about could get caught in the crossfire if he didn't get a handle on it. I'll call them, he muttered finally. What did you find on the SUV? Not much yet. It was rented under a fake ID. I'm digging deeper. These guys are small time, Calvin, but whoever's pulling their strings isn't. This feels like part of something bigger. Calvin's voice was a low growl. Then I'll deal with it one piece at a time. Be careful, Marcus warned. Don't go doing anything stupid. Calvin hung up without answering. He stepped out into the store again, staring at the neat rows of goods on the shelves. Outside, the neighborhood moved as it always did. People walking, kids laughing, life going on. But Calvin could feel the change, the tension settling like a fog. Later that afternoon, Detective Jessica Reed arrived in an unmarked cruiser. She stepped out, her tailored navy suit a sharp contrast to Eastgate's worn streets. She was young for a detective, with a crisp, no-nonsense demeanor and sharp hazel eyes that missed nothing. You the owner? She asked as she approached, a small notepad in hand. Calvin nodded. Yeah, Calvin Brooks. Detective Reed, she replied, flipping to a blank page. I hear you had an incident? Calvin led her inside, straight to the back room. Jessica surveyed the spray paint and vandalized goods with a practiced eye. Whoever did this wanted to send a message. That's what I figured, Calvin replied dryly. You got cameras? Footage only caught their backs. 2 of them came through the side door. Black hoodies, masks. Jessica sighed, scribbling notes. And this isn't the first time? Calvin shook his head. They showed up yesterday. 3 men. Said I should sell my store. I told them no. Jessica's gaze sharpened. They threatened you? Veiled threats. Said I'd regret it if I didn't. Jessica lowered her notepad, her tone softening just slightly. Mr. Brooks, this kind of intimidation is serious. If someone's trying to run you out, we need to know who. Did they say who they were working for? No names, Calvin said. But they're not acting on their own. They're too organized for that. Jessica studied him carefully. You have military training, don't you? Calvin didn't answer right away. Something like that. She nodded. I figured. You're calm for a guy who's being targeted. Calm doesn't mean I'm not paying attention. Jessica offered a faint smile. Fair enough. Look, I'll log this and run it up the chain. But I need you to be smart about this. Don't take matters into your own hands. Whoever's doing this isn't afraid of getting violent. Calvin met her gaze, his expression steady. Neither am I. Jessica sighed, closing her notepad. I'll be in touch. That night, Calvin sat in the small office, his eyes glued to the security monitor. The store was dark except for the faint glow of the screen, which flickered as it cycled through the camera feeds. It was quiet outside, almost unnervingly so. Then it happened. At 2:14 a.m., the side alley camera caught movement. A figure emerged from the shadows. A man in a hoodie carrying a small canister in his hand. Gasoline. Calvin shot to his feet, his pulse spiking. The man moved with purpose, approaching the back door and crouching low. Within seconds, he began dousing the base of the door with gas, the liquid pooling across the concrete. Calvin grabbed his baton and his phone, dialing 911 as he bolted for the back entrance. 911, what's your emergency? The dispatcher answered. Someone's trying to set my store on fire, Calvin said sharply, yanking the bolt on the back door. Get a unit here now. Stay on the line, sir. Calvin didn't listen. He stepped out into the alley, his voice cutting through the night like a whip. Hey! The man froze, his head snapping up. Calvin caught the faint glint of wide, panicked eyes under the hood before the man dropped the gas can and bolted. Calvin gave chase, his boots pounding against the pavement as he closed the distance. The man wasn't fast. Panic had made his movements sloppy. Calvin lunged, grabbing the back of his hoodie and yanking him to the ground. The man hit hard, gasping as he sprawled out on the concrete. Calvin loomed over him, his voice low and deadly. Who sent you? The man shook his head violently, his breath ragged. I don't know, man. I was just told to do it. By who? I don't know his name, the man stammered. I swear. The distant sound of sirens cut through the silence. The man thrashed, trying to break free, but Calvin pinned him in place. You go back and tell whoever's pulling your strings, Calvin said coldly, that I don't burn easy. Moments later, the squad cars screeched into the alley, their lights painting the walls red and blue. Officers piled out, shouting commands as Calvin released his hold and stepped back, his chest rising and falling with steady breaths. The thug was dragged to his feet, his face pale as the officers cuffed him. Detective Reed stepped out of one of the cars, her gaze locking onto Calvin. I told you not to take this into your own hands, she said, exasperated. I didn't, Calvin replied, his voice calm. He came to me. Jessica looked at the gas can lying nearby, her expression hardening. This changes things. Whoever sent him isn't playing games anymore. Calvin stared into the distance, the weight of her words settling in his chest. The storm wasn't coming, it was here. And Calvin Brooks wasn't going anywhere. The first rays of dawn stretched across the cracked streets of Eastgate, casting long shadows as the police finished up their work in the alley behind Calvin Brooks' store. The faint smell of gasoline lingered in the air, a bitter reminder of how close the store had come to being reduced to ashes. Calvin leaned against the back wall, arms crossed, his sharp eyes watching the last squad car pull away. Detective Jessica Reed approached him, her crisp suit now a little less immaculate, her face tired but resolute. She held a steaming cup of coffee in one hand and an evidence bag in the other. The crumpled gas can was inside. "Your little midnight guest isn't talking yet," she said, offering him the coffee. Calvin accepted it with a small nod of thanks. "He'll talk. Guys like him always do once they're cornered." Jessica arched an eyebrow. "You sound sure of that." "I've seen it before," Calvin said quietly, taking a sip. The coffee was scalding, but the heat grounded him. Pawns don't like being sacrificed. Jessica studied him carefully, then sighed, her shoulders relaxing slightly. "Listen, Brooks, I get it. You're a fighter. That's obvious. But I need you to let us handle this now. These people are dangerous." Calvin's eyes remained on the faint gasoline stains on the ground. "You think I don't know that?" "I know you do," Jessica replied. "But this isn't Afghanistan or wherever else you've fought before. You don't have backup here. You're on your own, and they're counting on that." Calvin looked up, locking eyes with her. "They're wrong." Jessica opened her mouth to respond, but her radio crackled to life. She sighed, stepping away as she listened to the dispatcher. Calvin watched her carefully before his phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out and glanced at the screen. "Marcus, tell me you've got something," Calvin said as he answered. "I've got more than something," Marcus replied, his voice sharp with urgency. "I dug deeper into the SUV rental and started pulling threads. It's connected to a shell company, some outfit called Silverline Holdings." "Doesn't sound familiar," Calvin replied, frowning. "It wouldn't," Marcus said. "Silverline's a front. The company doesn't exist beyond paperwork, but I traced its bank transactions. You know who's behind it? Howard Ellison." Calvin's grip on the phone tightened at the name. "Ellison? As in Ellison Properties?" "The same. Big-time developer. He's been buying up half the city, turning neighborhoods like Eastgate into high-end condos. Gentrification at its finest. My guess? He's clearing out anyone who doesn't want to sell, and he's not afraid to get dirty doing it." Calvin's blood ran cold. He'd heard the name Howard Ellison before. Ellison Properties was everywhere these days, on billboards, construction signs, and news segments about revitalizing forgotten parts of the city. Calvin had dismissed the rumors about Ellison's methods as idle talk. Now he knew better. "This guy's got money and lawyers," Marcus continued. "He's not sending random thugs to intimidate you. He's playing chess, and you're in his way." Calvin's jaw clenched. "Not for long." "Careful, man," Marcus warned. "If Ellison catches wind you're digging into him, he'll turn up the heat." Calvin's voice was steady. "Let him try." By mid-morning, the store was open again. Calvin moved methodically through the aisles, restocking shelves and keeping his mind focused on the task at hand. He refused to let Ellison's thugs shake him. Customers trickled in as usual, their greetings a little softer, their looks a little more concerned. News traveled fast in Eastgate. As he knelt to stack a row of soup cans, Calvin heard the bell above the door chime. He glanced up to see Andre Carter, the pastor from the neighborhood church, standing in the doorway. Andre was a tall, broad-shouldered man in his late 50s, his face weathered but kind. "Morning, Mr. Brooks," Andre said, stepping inside and adjusting his coat. "Heard about what happened last night." Calvin straightened, wiping his hands on his apron. "Morning, Pastor. Word travels fast." "It always does," Andre replied, his gaze sweeping the store. "People are worried, Calvin. Folks are talking about what happened here and wondering who's next." Calvin exhaled slowly. "That's what they want. They're trying to scare people." Andre's expression darkened. "Well, they've picked the wrong community for that." Calvin allowed himself a faint smile. "That's good to hear." "Listen," Andre said, lowering his voice. "I've been hearing things, rumors about a developer who's been pushing hard to buy up Eastgate Properties. People getting strange offers to sell, businesses getting vandalized. It's not just you." Calvin's brow furrowed. "Howard Ellison?" Andre nodded grimly. "That's the name." "I've got someone looking into him," Calvin replied. "If we can prove he's behind this, we can stop him." Andre studied Calvin for a long moment. You're putting yourself on the front line for all of us. You know that? Someone has to, Calvin said quietly. Andre smiled, clapping a hand on Calvin's shoulder. If you need anything, you know where to find me. This neighborhood's stronger than Ellison thinks. Calvin nodded, his resolve hardening even further. I'll remember that. That night, Calvin sat at the small table in his back office, the screen of his laptop glowing dimly in the dark. Marcus had sent over a folder of documents, financial records, property transactions, and court cases tied to Ellison Properties. It was all legal on the surface, but there were patterns. Properties sold suspiciously low. Owners who'd refused to sell found their businesses vandalized or burned out. Every trail led back to Ellison's front companies, but nothing ever stuck. Calvin rubbed his tired eyes and leaned back in his chair. He'd seen corruption before, but it never stopped making his blood boil. Men like Ellison profited off the backs of honest people, destroying neighborhoods to build gleaming towers no one from Eastgate could afford to live in. He wasn't about to let that happen here. The faint buzz of his phone broke the silence. Calvin grabbed it and answered. Marcus. You're not gonna like this, Marcus said, his tone tense. I've been monitoring the police scanner. Someone torched a laundromat a few blocks from your store. Calvin sat up straight, his pulse quickening. The Johnsons' place? Yeah, they're fine. Weren't there when it happened. But this is how it starts, Calvin. One business at a time. Calvin's jaw tightened. He thought of the Johnsons, an elderly couple who'd run that laundromat for 20 years, saving up every penny to keep it going. It was more than just a building. It was a lifeline for the neighborhood. This isn't random, Calvin said. They're sending a message. And it's working, Marcus replied. People are scared, Calvin. You can't fix this alone. I'm not fixing it alone, Calvin muttered. But I won't sit back and let them tear this place apart. Then you'd better get ready, Marcus said grimly. Because if they're torching businesses now, you're next. Calvin hung up and stared at the darkened screen of his laptop. His mind was sharp and clear now, the weight of what was coming settling on his shoulders like armor. Ellison's people thought they could intimidate him, scare him out like they had others. They were wrong. Calvin stood, his movements deliberate as he unlocked the small safe in the corner of the office. Inside was a tactical flashlight, a collapsible baton, and a small stack of documents he'd compiled so far. He strapped the baton to his belt, tucking the flashlight into his pocket. He stepped to the front of the store, flipping the sign to closed and locking the doors. The street outside was dark and quiet, but Calvin felt eyes watching from the shadows. He turned toward the darkness, his voice low and steady. Come on, then. The words weren't a threat. They were a promise. The night was heavy with silence, broken only by the distant hum of traffic. Calvin Brooks sat in his dimly lit back office, his eyes fixed on the grainy footage playing on the security monitor. The flames from the laundromat 2 blocks over still flickered in his mind, haunting him like the shadows stretching through his store. He couldn't sleep, not with what he knew was coming. The people behind this, Howard Ellison and his enforcers, had moved past intimidation. Now they were taking down the neighborhood piece by piece, and Calvin knew it wouldn't stop until someone forced their hand. Every muscle in his body ached with tension, but his resolve was unshakable. He wasn't going anywhere. Calvin leaned back in his chair and checked his phone. A message from Marcus flashed across the screen. They're targeting more tonight. Be ready. Calvin's jaw clenched as he read the words. This wasn't just a random attack anymore. It was a calculated campaign. The Johnsons' laundromat was just the first domino. Calvin knew his store was next on the list. He stood, grabbing the collapsible baton from the safe and tucking it into his belt. He slipped a flashlight into his pocket and checked the locks one last time. The store was as secure as it could be, but Calvin knew that wouldn't stop what was coming. The faint buzz of his phone pulled him from his thoughts. It was Marcus again. Calvin, Marcus said as soon as he answered, his voice low but urgent. I got another hit on Ellison's crew. They've been seen near 5th and Hawthorne, close to your store. They're circling, Calvin replied, his tone steady. Yeah, and they're not alone this time. I picked up chatter about something bigger going down tonight. I don't know what, but it's not just petty vandalism anymore. Then I'll be here waiting, Calvin said. Marcus' voice turned sharp. I'm serious, man. Don't play hero. You're good, but these guys aren't amateurs. They're coming prepared. Calvin's lips curled into a faint, grim smile. So am I. Calvin. I'll be fine, Calvin cut him off. Let me know if you hear more. He hung up before Marcus could argue and slid the phone back into his pocket. Calvin turned off the lights in the store, leaving only the faint glow of the security monitors illuminating the space. He moved quietly through the aisles, double-checking every lock and window, his senses heightened. Hours passed. Midnight came and went, and the streets outside fell into an eerie stillness. Calvin sat behind the counter, his baton within reach and his eyes on the security monitors. Every creak of the building, every gust of wind rattling the windows, felt sharper, like the edge of a knife against his skin. Then, at 2:47 a.m., the motion sensor on the back alley camera triggered. Calvin straightened, his pulse quickening. On the screen, 3 figures in hoodies moved silently through the alley. One of them carried a crowbar, another a gas can, and the last one held something small and metallic, a lighter. Calvin exhaled slowly, steadying his breathing. He knew what was about to happen. They were going to smash their way in, douse the place with gasoline, and light it up, just like they had with the Johnson's laundromat. Not tonight. Calvin rose to his feet, grabbing his baton and flashlight. He moved to the back of the store, his footsteps silent as he approached the alley door. He paused there, listening. The faint scrape of the crowbar against the lock sent a surge of cold adrenaline through his veins. Calvin waited until the sound of the lock being pried open stopped. The door cracked slightly, and he could hear the men whispering to each other. One of them pushed the door open wider, stepping into the darkened storage room. Calvin struck. The first thug didn't even have time to cry out. Calvin swung the baton hard, catching him across the ribs. The man staggered back, gasping in pain, but Calvin was already moving. He shoved the second man into the shelves, the metal clanging loudly as boxes tumbled to the floor. "What the?" one of them shouted, but Calvin's flashlight beam cut through the darkness, blinding them. "Get out of my store," Calvin growled, his voice low and deadly. The third thug, the one with the lighter, fumbled for something in his pocket, but Calvin closed the distance with a swift, practiced motion. He knocked the lighter to the ground and jabbed the baton into the man's thigh, sending him sprawling. "Go!" one of them yelled, panic lacing his voice. The 3 men scrambled to their feet, crashing into each other in their haste to escape. Calvin stepped back, his breath coming in steady, controlled bursts as he watched them flee down the alley. He didn't chase them. He didn't need to. They'd gotten the message. Calvin bent down to retrieve the lighter, turning it over in his hand. It was cheap and worn, but the significance wasn't lost on him. If he hadn't been here, if he decided to run like they wanted, this place would have been gone. He slipped the lighter into his pocket and straightened, wincing slightly as the adrenaline began to fade and the ache in his ribs returned. Calvin knew this wasn't over. Scaring off a few thugs wouldn't stop Ellison. If anything, it would escalate things further. The next morning, Detective Jessica Reed stood in the alley behind the store, examining the damage to the back door. She glanced at Calvin, her expression a mix of frustration and admiration. "You're lucky," she said finally. "You could have gotten yourself killed." "I wasn't the one holding a gas can," Calvin replied calmly, his arms crossed. Jessica shook her head. "You've got a target on your back now. You know that, right? Whoever's pulling the strings isn't going to let this slide." "Good," Calvin said simply. "I'm counting on it." Jessica stared at him for a long moment before sighing. "Look, I can get a patrol unit to swing by more often, but I need you to start working with me. If we're going to take down whoever's behind this, I need evidence. Something we can use to make it stick." Calvin nodded slowly. "I might have something for you soon." Jessica raised an eyebrow. "What kind of something?" Calvin didn't answer. Instead, he looked past her, his eyes narrowing slightly as a black sedan rolled slowly down the street. The windows were tinted, and it moved too deliberately, lingering for a moment before speeding off. "They're watching," Calvin said softly. Jessica followed his gaze, her expression hardening. "Then we'll watch back." That afternoon, Calvin sat in his back office with Marcus on the phone. "I need more on Ellison," Calvin said, flipping through the folder Marcus had sent earlier. "Something concrete. Something I can take to Detective Reed." Marcus sighed on the other end. "I'm working on it, but Ellison's smart. He doesn't put his name on anything dirty. Everything runs through fronts and fake companies." "Then keep pulling threads," Calvin replied firmly. "I will, but you need to lay low, Calvin. These guys are out for blood now. I don't care how tough you are. Sooner or later, they're going to catch you off guard." "They can try," Calvin said. After hanging up, Calvin sat back in his chair, staring at the grainy footage of the thugs fleeing from the alley. He knew Marcus was right. Ellison's people wouldn't stop until they'd either driven him out or buried him. Calvin's gaze drifted toward the lighter he'd confiscated the night before, now sitting on the desk beside him. It wasn't much, but it was a start, a thread to pull. And Calvin Brooks was done waiting. If Ellison wanted a fight, he was about to get one. The evening sky over Eastgate was tinged with gray as Calvin Brooks stood in front of his store, the weight of the day pressing heavy on his shoulders. A brisk wind cut through the narrow streets, carrying the sounds of a neighborhood trying to move on despite the storm brewing around it. Calvin's eyes scanned the horizon as if waiting for trouble to show its face again. He didn't need to wait long. A black sedan with tinted windows rolled slowly down the street, pausing just long enough for Calvin to see the faint outline of a face behind the glass. The car didn't stop this time. It kept moving, disappearing around the corner, but Calvin knew exactly what it meant. Howard Ellison's people were watching him. He turned back toward the store, locking the door behind him and flipping the sign to closed. Inside, the store was quiet, the faint hum of the refrigerators the only sound that broke the stillness. Calvin moved to the back office, where his laptop and a stack of documents sat waiting. He'd spent the better part of the day piecing together the evidence Marcus had sent over: property deeds, bank transfers, and records tying Silverline Holdings to Ellison's larger empire. It wasn't enough yet. Ellison was smart. He buried his tracks under layers of paper and paid off middlemen. But Calvin wasn't about to let him slip away. He stared at the documents spread out on his desk, then reached for his phone. An hour later, Marcus Evans sat across from Calvin in the back office, his laptop humming softly as he scrolled through a series of files. Marcus looked tired, his eyes bloodshot, but his focus never wavered. "This is deeper than I thought," Marcus said, pulling up a map on his screen. "Ellison's company has been acquiring properties all over Eastgate for the last year. Laundromats, corner stores, auto shops. He's targeting small businesses and forcing owners to sell." "And when they don't?" Calvin asked quietly. Marcus turned to look at him. "Then guys like the ones you dealt with last night show up?" Calvin's jaw tightened. He already knew that part. The question that haunted him now was how far Ellison was willing to go. "So, what's his endgame?" he asked. "Luxury condos, maybe a retail complex," Marcus replied. "The whole neighborhood's prime real estate. Once the old businesses are gone, Ellison sweeps in, knocks down what's left, and builds. He's already got investors lined up." Calvin nodded grimly. "So he's turning people's homes and livelihoods into profit." "Exactly," Marcus said. "And no one's stopping him. He's got the money, the lawyers, and the muscle to keep people quiet." Calvin leaned back in his chair, his gaze fixed on the map Marcus had pulled up. Red dots marked every property Ellison had targeted in the neighborhood. It was worse than Calvin had imagined. Block after block hollowed out, families and businesses driven out with nowhere to go. Marcus studied him carefully. "So, what's the plan, Calvin? You can't fight a guy like Ellison on your own." "I'm not alone," Calvin said, his voice steady. "This isn't just about me. It's about everyone Ellison's trying to steamroll. The people here have been putting up with this for too long. And you think they'll fight?" Marcus asked skeptically. "They will," Calvin replied. "They just need someone to stand with them." The next morning, Calvin met with Andre Carter, the pastor from the local church. They sat on the worn wooden pews in the empty chapel, sunlight streaming through the stained glass windows. Andre leaned forward, his hands clasped together as Calvin laid out everything he'd learned. "This man, Howard Ellison, he's not just targeting me," Calvin said. "He's coming for the whole neighborhood. If we don't push back now, there won't be anything left to save." Andre frowned, shaking his head slowly. People here are scared, Calvin. After the laundromat, after everything, they're starting to believe there's nothing they can do. That's what Ellison wants, Calvin replied, his voice calm but firm. He wants us to feel powerless, but we're not. Andre looked up, his gaze searching Calvin's face. And you? You're willing to lead this fight? Calvin nodded. Someone has to. Andre studied him for a moment, then exhaled deeply. I'll talk to people, see who's willing to step up. But Calvin, this isn't just a fight against a few thugs. Ellison's got power. I've faced worse, Calvin replied quietly. And I don't quit. Andre's expression softened into a faint smile. I know you don't. That's why people look up to you. That afternoon, Calvin and Andre visited the Johnson family, the owners of the laundromat that had been burned down. The couple sat at their kitchen table, their faces lined with worry as Calvin explained everything Ellison was doing. He wants to scare you into selling, Calvin said, but you don't have to give in. Mr. Johnson, a wiry man in his 60s, shook his head. It's easy for you to say, Calvin. My business is gone. Even if we don't sell, what are we supposed to do? I'm working on getting proof, something the police can use to go after Ellison, Calvin said. But we need to stand together. If we don't, he'll pick us off one by one. Mrs. Johnson placed a hand on her husband's arm. He's right. We've been here too long to let someone take this from us. Mr. Johnson sighed, his shoulders slumping slightly. What do you need us to do? Stay strong, Calvin said. Don't let them bully you. And spread the word. The more people we have on our side, the harder it'll be for Ellison to keep this quiet. As night fell, Calvin returned to his store, his mind racing. He could feel the tide starting to turn, but he knew Ellison wouldn't back down without a fight. People like him never did. Calvin locked the doors and checked the security monitors one last time. The neighborhood outside was quiet, but it felt like the calm before the storm. Calvin sat behind the counter, his baton within reach and his phone on the table beside him. If Ellison's men came back tonight, they wouldn't find him unprepared. The phone buzzed, startling him slightly. It was a message from Marcus. Got something big. Meet me tomorrow. Be careful tonight. Calvin set the phone down and leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. The weight of what lay ahead pressed on him, but he welcomed it. He wasn't just defending his store anymore. He was defending Eastgate and the people who called it home. As the clock crept past midnight, Calvin sat alone in the darkened store, waiting. The silence stretched on, broken only by the faint creak of the building and the hum of the refrigeration units. Outside, the streetlights flickered faintly, casting long shadows that danced across the sidewalk. Calvin's hand rested on the baton as he stared at the monitors, waiting for the storm to break. And when it did, Calvin Brooks would be ready. The morning light cut through the gray clouds as Calvin Brooks drove through Eastgate, the weight of the fight pressing against him like armor. He gripped the steering wheel with one hand, the other resting near the folder of documents Marcus had sent him late last night. In his gut, he knew today would change everything, for better or worse. Marcus had called him after hours of digging into Howard Ellison's operations. What he uncovered was damning. A ledger filled with payouts, fake shell companies, and recorded cash drops to thugs like the ones Calvin had fought off. The evidence was concrete, tying Ellison directly to the intimidation and destruction that had plagued the neighborhood. Calvin didn't know how Marcus had gotten his hands on it, and he didn't ask. All that mattered was that now they had something to fight back with. Calvin pulled into the church parking lot, where Pastor Andre Carter was already waiting, leaning against the side of his rusted pickup truck. The pastor looked up as Calvin approached, his face lined with quiet determination. He'd been talking to members of the community all night, rallying support and spreading the word. Enough was enough. You get what you need? Andre asked as Calvin climbed out of the car, holding the folder under his arm. More than enough, Calvin replied, handing him a printed sheet Marcus had pulled together. Proof. Real proof that Ellison's behind all of it. Andre scanned the paper, his expression hardening. This is what we needed. People are ready, Calvin. You lit the fire. Now we just have to make sure it doesn't burn us. It won't, Calvin said, his voice steady. Not if we play this smart. Andre nodded. folding the paper and slipping it into his coat. "We've got a community meeting in an hour. I'm bringing as many business owners and families as I can. You coming?" "I'll be there," Calvin replied. "But first, I need to make a stop." Marcus Evans lived in a small loft just outside Eastgate, his walls plastered with maps, notes, and tech equipment that looked like something out of a spy movie. When Calvin arrived, Marcus was at his desk, a steaming cup of coffee in one hand and his other hand scrolling through screens filled with data. "You made good time," Marcus said without looking up. Calvin set the folder on the desk. "I want to hear it from you. How solid is this?" Marcus swiveled in his chair, looking Calvin square in the eye. "It's rock solid. That ledger? It's the smoking gun. Ellison's name doesn't appear directly, but I traced the shell companies and payments back to him. Half the businesses he's acquired were targeted the same way: threats, vandalism, arson. He's been doing this for years, and Eastgate's just his latest prize." Calvin's fists clenched. "And the cops?" Marcus sighed. "That's where it gets tricky. You hand this to Detective Reed, and she'll take it up the chain. But Ellison has connections, city council, big law firms, the works. The second he hears about this, he's going to try to bury it." Calvin's eyes narrowed. "Then we don't give him the chance." Marcus tilted his head, curiosity sparking in his eyes. "What are you planning?" "Reed's been straight with me so far," Calvin said. "I'll give her what we've got, but at the same time, we take this public. Ellison can't bury what everyone's already seen." Marcus let out a low whistle, grinning faintly. "You're talking about making this a fight in the court of public opinion. People need to know what he's doing," Calvin replied. "If the whole city's watching, Ellison won't be able to hide." "You sure you're ready for that kind of heat?" Marcus asked. "I don't have a choice," Calvin said quietly. The community center was packed. Rows of folding chairs were filled with business owners, parents, and residents who had lived in Eastgate their entire lives. The air hummed with tension and quiet determination as Pastor Andre stepped to the front, raising his hands to call for silence. "Thank you for coming," Andre said, his voice steady. "We're here because our neighborhood, our home, is under attack. Some of you have already seen it firsthand. The vandalism, the fires, the threats. It's not random, and it's not going to stop unless we stand together." The crowd murmured, voices rising with agreement and frustration. Calvin stood at the back of the room, holding the folder in his hands as Andre continued. "Howard Ellison and his people want us gone," Andre said. "He wants to tear down what we've built so he can turn a profit. But we're not powerless. We're stronger together, and today, we're drawing a line in the sand." Andre motioned for Calvin to join him at the front. As Calvin walked to the center of the room, all eyes turned to him. The crowd fell silent, waiting. "I know a lot of you are scared," Calvin began, his voice calm but firm. "I've seen what they're doing, what they've already done to families like the Johnsons. But they don't win unless we let them." He held up the folder. "This is proof. Real proof that Ellison's been pulling the strings. Marcus Evans, who some of you know, found the paper trail, payouts, fake companies, everything. This isn't just thugs causing trouble. This is a coordinated attack." A ripple of anger moved through the room. One man stood up, his voice rising. "What are we supposed to do? He's got money, lawyers. We don't stand a chance." Calvin shook his head. "We stand together. That's what they don't expect. I've already spoken with Detective Reed. She's willing to take this to her bosses, but we can't stop there. We go public, news stations, social media, everywhere. We let the whole city see what's happening here." A woman in the front row stood, her voice firm. "And if they come after us?" Calvin's gaze swept the room. "Then we stand our ground. They think we're weak, but we're not. This neighborhood isn't just buildings and streets, it's people. And people like us? We fight back." The room erupted into applause, a wave of energy cutting through the tension. People who had once been too afraid to speak now shouted in agreement, rallying behind Calvin's words. Pastor Andre stepped up beside Calvin, clapping a hand on his shoulder. "We start tonight," Andre said, raising his voice over the crowd. "We spread the word. We tell the truth. And we don't back down." That night, Calvin sat alone in the darkened store, staring at the security monitors. He'd handed the folder over to Jessica Reed earlier, and she promised to push it up the chain, but Calvin knew the real fight was just beginning. The community was awake now, angry, united, and ready to fight for their home. But Ellison wouldn't take this lying down. Calvin could feel it in his bones. The phone buzzed on the counter, pulling him from his thoughts. It was a message from Marcus. "Be careful tonight." I picked up chatter. "Ellison knows about the meeting. He's sending people your way." Calvin set the phone down, his expression hardening as he reached under the counter for the collapsible baton. He flicked off the store lights, plunging the room into darkness as he watched the monitors. Outside, the night seemed darker than usual, the streetlights dim and flickering. A black SUV pulled up across the street, its headlights shutting off as the engine idled. Calvin's grip on the baton tightened. He wasn't afraid. He wasn't backing down. If Ellison's men were coming, they'd find Calvin Brooks waiting. And this time, they'd realize just how wrong they were to think they could break him. The night outside Calvin Brooks' store was silent, too silent. From his position behind the counter, he watched the security monitors, his sharp eyes tracking every movement on the grainy black and white feeds. The black SUV that had parked across the street hadn't moved for over 10 minutes, its engine a faint hum in the quiet. Calvin knew what this was. A test. Ellison's men had been sent to finish what they'd started. This wasn't just about intimidation anymore. It was about sending a message to Calvin, to Eastgate, and to anyone else who dared stand in Howard Ellison's way. Calvin exhaled slowly, his hand tightening around the handle of his collapsible baton. "Let them come," he muttered under his breath. The clock ticked past midnight when the first figure moved. The side alley camera caught it. A man in a hoodie stepping out of the SUV, his face hidden in shadow. Two others followed him, moving quickly, carrying crowbars and duffel bags. Calvin watched as they spread out, one heading for the back entrance, the other two toward the front. He knew their plan before they did it. Block the exits. Get inside. Destroy the place. Not tonight. Calvin moved through the darkened store silently, every step deliberate. Years of military training kicked in, his heartbeat steady despite the tension crawling up his spine. He knew what was at stake. His store, his community, his stand against Ellison. Calvin reached the back door, his ear pressed against the cold metal. The faint sound of tools scraping at the lock reached him. His jaw clenched. They were trying to force their way in. From his belt, Calvin pulled a small canister of pepper spray, its weight familiar in his grip. He wasn't looking for a fight, but he wasn't going to let them win, either. The back door creaked as the lock gave way. One of the men eased the door open, flashlight in hand, its beam cutting through the darkness of the storage room. He stepped inside, his boots crunching faintly against scattered gravel. He never saw Calvin coming. With practiced speed, Calvin stepped out of the shadows, grabbed the man's arm, and twisted hard. The crowbar clattered to the ground as the man let out a sharp cry. Calvin sprayed the pepper spray straight into his face, the man collapsing to his knees, gasping and clawing at his eyes. "Stay down," Calvin ordered coldly. Before he could move, Calvin heard the crash of glass at the front of the store. The other two had forced their way in, shattering one of the display windows. Calvin grabbed the crowbar off the floor and moved quickly, cutting through the aisles like a shadow. In the dim glow of the streetlights spilling through the broken window, the two men were tearing through shelves, knocking cans and goods to the floor. One of them, a tall, wiry man, held a crowbar of his own, smashing a nearby display case. "Where's the old man?" he snarled, his voice echoing through the store. "I'm right here," Calvin said, stepping into view. Both men froze, their flashlights snapping toward him. For a moment, the room was silent except for the distant hum of the refrigerators. "You don't know when to quit, do you?" the wiry man growled, advancing with his crowbar. Calvin didn't reply. He held his ground, his expression calm and unyielding. When the man lunged, swinging the crowbar, Calvin moved. He sidestepped the strike, ducking low as the metal whistled past his head. With a swift motion, he drove the crowbar into the man's side, sending him sprawling to the floor with a grunt. The second man hesitated, his eyes darting between Calvin and his fallen partner. "You don't stand a chance, old man," he shouted, his voice wavering. Calvin's voice was steady as a rock. Then come find out. The man charged, swinging a flashlight like a weapon, but Calvin was ready. He parried the strike with his own crowbar, then delivered a sharp jab to the man's shoulder. The flashlight clattered to the ground as the thug staggered back, clutching his arm in pain. "You think this is over?" the wiry man hissed, struggling to his feet. "Ellison will sin more. You can't stop him." Calvin stepped closer, his gaze unwavering. "Tell him I'm not going anywhere." The sound of distant sirens cut through the night air. The men froze, their confidence breaking as the faint red and blue lights reflected off the shattered glass. Calvin didn't move. He stood tall, watching as the thugs scrambled to escape. One man dragged his partner through the broken window, both of them limping back toward the SUV. The vehicle roared to life and sped off into the night, leaving behind the wreckage they'd caused. Calvin exhaled, his shoulders relaxing slightly as the sirens grew louder. He moved to the front of the store, stepping through broken glass and overturned shelves. Moments later, 2 squad cars pulled up, the flashing lights filling the store with a harsh glow. Detective Jessica Reed arrived on the scene minutes later, her coat flapping in the wind as she stepped over the broken window frame. Her sharp eyes swept the damage, then landed on Calvin, who was leaning against the counter with a tired but resolute expression. "Let me guess," Jessica said dryly. "You didn't call for backup again." "They didn't give me time," Calvin replied, his voice calm. Jessica sighed, pulling out her notepad. "You're lucky, Brooks. If they caught you off guard, this could have ended a lot worse." "They did catch me off guard," Calvin said, gesturing to the broken shelves. "But I'm still here." Jessica studied him for a long moment before shaking her head. "I've got my team pulling footage from your cameras. We'll match it to the reports we're building on Ellison." Calvin's gaze sharpened. "You think it's enough to take him down?" Jessica hesitated. "We're close. Between your evidence and the mess his crew just made here tonight, Ellison's running out of places to hide. But it's not over yet. He's desperate now, and desperate men are dangerous." Calvin nodded, his face set with quiet determination. "Then we finish it." The next day, news of the attack spread like wildfire. Photos of Calvin's shattered store appeared on local news stations and social media, along with reports of Howard Ellison's suspected involvement in a campaign to intimidate and displace small business owners. Pastor Andre Carter gathered the community again that evening, this time outside Calvin's store. Families, shopkeepers, and neighbors stood shoulder to shoulder, their faces filled with anger and resolve. The crowd grew as people trickled in, drawn by the news and the fight Calvin had started. Calvin stepped forward, his voice carrying over the quiet crowd. "This isn't just about my store. It's about all of us. For too long, they've tried to push us out, tried to make us feel small. But we're still here, and we're not going anywhere." Cheers erupted from the crowd, their voices rising like a wave. Calvin looked out over the sea of faces and felt something he hadn't in years: hope. The following week, Detective Reed's team raided Ellison Properties' offices. With the evidence Calvin and Marcus had provided, they uncovered even more: payments, threats, and connections to arson cases across the city. Howard Ellison was arrested in his glass-walled office, his polished smile replaced with rage as he was led out in handcuffs. The fight was over. For Calvin, it wasn't about winning. It was about showing Ellison and others like him that the people of Eastgate wouldn't be broken. The neighborhood still had scars, but it stood stronger now, united in a way it hadn't been before. A week later, Calvin stood in front of his repaired store. The windows were new, the shelves restocked, and the sign above the door gleamed under the morning sun. Pastor Andre approached, hands in his coat pockets, and smiled faintly. "Still standing, I see," Andre said. "Always," Calvin replied, looking out at the street where kids played and neighbors passed by, waving. Andre nodded. "They'll remember this, you know, what you did." Calvin smiled faintly, his gaze steady. "It wasn't just me. It was all of us." Andre clapped him on the shoulder before walking off, leaving Calvin to stand alone in front of the store. He took a deep breath, letting the cool air fill his lungs. The fight had been long, but Eastgate was still here. And so was he.